From every mountain and valley the world over are flowers and plants of simple beauty. Some hold a natural wonder, chemicals that soothe pain and inspire euphoria. At times, they've been hailed as a gift of heaven, but in the last century, they've been condemned as a scourge of man. Once, marijuana, cocaine, opium, ecstasy, LSD, even heroin were perfectly legal. Today, they compel a war on drugs. Did these plants and drugs change, or did we?
Drugs are menacing our society.
It's like a 5-hour orgasm.
Used wisely, can produce the greatest ecstasy that man knows.
Drug lords call it Calle de Oro, the path of gold, the smuggler's highway. Here, tons of coca leaves travel from Nicaragua, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, to become the granular white powder of cocaine. From planes on jungle runways or anything that floats, cocaine arrives in Florida and the East Coast. Through Mexico, by land or air, it reaches Texas and the West. Each year, 150 million tons reach 15 million Americans and 1.5 million addicts.
The first time I shot up with cocaine, it was, you feel like you're in a tunnel and somebody's pounding on the side of a metal building, and your head's going boom, 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 and your heart's racing, and which is what they call the rush.
6 transactions mark cocaine's trip from wholesale leaf markets to street dealers who sell a gram at a time. On the way, guards escort the leaf harvest to secluded processing plants, where it is transformed into a product that sells for $192,000 a kilo in the United States. Money fuels the supply, and addiction drives the demand for a drug that defies the best efforts of law enforcement to stop it.
Police, get on the ground, get on the ground, get on the ground, get on the ground.
It was better than sex. It was better than the best thing I ever tried. The feeling is undescribable. Crack put me in a state of mind, whereas I didn't care about anything, didn't care about nobody. My main objective was to use cocaine, regardless to what the consequences was.
For the user, the price of cocaine and its evil twin, crack, include the distinct possibility of death. Cocaine can stop a heart cold and kills heart tissue on contact. No one is immune, from Hollywood stars to college kids.
I spoke earlier with a couple of our people about an 18-year-old cocaine overdose who was brought in comatose. His temperature was 108, and we never could get his temperature down. He literally cooked.
Cocaine stimulates the heart and makes its rhythm go up so quickly it loses sync with itself. And if it loses sync with itself, that's called a ventricular fibrillation. And a ventricular fibrillation means your heart is not functioning, and you expire very quickly from that process. You just keel over and die.
For most of its history, cocaine was misclassified as a narcotic, a drug that depresses the nervous system. In fact, it's a powerful stimulant. Cocaine activates norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin, chemicals that stimulate movement, excitement, and feelings of pleasure.
When you get excited, when you get frightened, when you get startled, your brain has to make you react to get out of harm's way. Cocaine does the same thing in the brain at the same place without you needing for that to occur.
Of all the illicit drugs in America, what makes cocaine so unique is the power of its addiction to a feeling of pleasure. In this 1972 test, monkeys are injected with cocaine, then placed in situations to choose between seeing other monkeys or being injected with unlimited amounts of the drug in isolation. The monkeys choose to be alone with cocaine. They also choose the drug over food to the point of starvation. Startling proof of how powerful and dangerous cocaine addiction is after one dose. Before cocaine became one of the most addictive drugs in the modern world, it was nothing more than one of a dozen alkaloids, or natural chemicals, in the leaf of the erythroxylon coca plant, a leaf chewed by ancient and indigenous natives of South America for a boost of energy. Ancient Andean tribes believed it was given by the gods and reserved its pleasures for royalty and high priests. Over time, the practice spread to common people to overcome the fatigue brought on by the oxygen-thin air of the Andes Mountains.
They used it much as we take coffee breaks, they would have coca breaks. They call it coca chewing, but actually it's sucking coca. They put a water leaf in their mouth and a little bit of an alkaline substance, and they suck it for 45 minutes, and they get an effect which is not unlike what we get from a cup of well-caffeinated coffee.
In its natural habitat, the coca leaf was nothing more than an herbal stimulant. The leaf produced no dangerous side effects. But that was about to change soon after the secrets of the coca leaf came to the attention of an Italian doctor in 1850. Coca's notoriety came to the attention of a pharmaceutical company in Germany. There, the ancient leaf collided with modern chemistry in 1860, when Albert Niemann, researching the drug's chemical properties, isolated coca's active ingredient. Niemann named the crystalline substance cocaine. Niemann had stripped the leaf of its moderating substances and unwittingly created the world's most addictive drug, a chemical Frankenstein, derived from nature, yet so unnatural. Soon after, it was apparent that cocaine possessed strangely powerful mood-altering properties, a fact early movies toyed with.
Stealing through my body.
Though Niemann was searching for a drug to benefit humankind, his discovery would produce the opposite effect. In a generation's time, cocaine was called the world's third scourge. Behind alcohol and opium, it was yet another evil genie inadvertently let loose upon the world. But before its harms could be curbed, cocaine wrought decades of unrelenting havoc to anyone foolish enough to underestimate its power.
Is this something really good?
It's nothing like it. First thing you know, you'll want nothing else but.
The History Channel now returns to Hooked, illegal drugs and how they got that way.
1863, cocaine arrives in the United States as an unknown ingredient in Van Mariani, a wine patented by a Corsican chemist of the same name. No one has ever heard of cocaine or knows what it is, but everyone likes it.
It became enormously successful. He made a fortune on it. And he was a very, very shrewd promoter. He had 3,000 physicians who had signed on as endorsing Van Mariani. He had many celebrities, people like Thomas Edison. Pope Leo XIII is said never to have gone anywhere without a flask of Van Mariani under his robes.
And in fact, Mark Twain bought copious amounts of Van Mariani and delivered it to Ulysses Grant as he was dying from throat cancer and struggling to write his memoirs. And it was considered to be an invigorating tonic that would help anyone who suffered from just about any type of ailment.
Van Mariani is liquid gold. Though American consumers are unfamiliar with its mysterious ingredient, savvy entrepreneurs, seeing how much people like it, begin adding it to anything they can. Cocaine is a sales bonanza. One of the best ideas belongs to John Stive Pemberton. At a time when temperance movements call for a prohibition on alcohol, Pemberton concocts a non-alcoholic health drink, a mineral water beverage laced with cocaine. Pemberton's reason to make the tonic is simple enough. He uses it to treat his addiction to morphine. Pemberton's tonic becomes so popular that another man, Asa Candler, buys Pemberton's formula and parlays it into an empire and a national icon.
Candler was the man who was responsible for drugstores having those stools around where people would come in and they would say, "Give me a shot in the arm." And for a couple of pennies, they would get a glass of Coca-Cola, with the real classic Coke, the Coke with the cocaine in it. And they would, yes, they would feel better. They'd be energetic.
It was advertised as a tonic which gave you energy when you were tired and was a great cure for a headache as well.
All this for a nickel. Many a temperance movement warrior takes strength from a refreshing glass of Coke to rail at alcohol. Little do they know, in the decades ahead, cocaine would become more hated than liquor. As for Pemberton's drug addiction, he merely substitutes morphine for cocaine. Cocaine's appeal doesn't stop in a health drink of mineral water and bubbles. It makes a fortune as an ingredient in self-administered medicines, from healing teas to pep pills. And if making pain go away makes a good medicine, cocaine is a perfect remedy.
Cocaine was, like morphine before it, seen as a miracle cure. And one of the groups to seize upon this was the Hay Fever Association. Because cocaine did constrict blood vessels, it seemed like it might have been an appropriate cure for asthma sufferers. So many asthma preparations contained some cocoa or some cocaine.
By 1890, cocaine is everywhere and used for everything. Baseball players use it on the diamond, a practice that today would result in expulsion from the game. In dockyards and work camps, cocaine is supplied to African American employees to enable them to work longer and without fatigue. Cocaine is even popularized in one of the best-selling books of the day, The 7% Solution. It's portrayed as a favorite drug of the wise and daring Sherlock Holmes, who eagerly injects it every day.
With his long white fingers, he adjusted the delicate needle and thrust the sharp point home, pressed down the tiny piston, and sank back into the velvet-lined armchair with a long sigh of satisfaction.
Well, the Sherlock Holmes stories actually help you understand the first cocaine epidemic, because all of these epidemics start with a favorable attitude toward the drugs, a tolerance of their use or enthusiasm for their use. And only as time goes on, say 20 years, do people start changing their mind. They see the effects of long-term use and paranoia, violence, and so on and so forth. And then they become very fearful of cocaine.
At a time when morphine addiction among Civil War veterans is rampant and alcoholism is high, cocaine is used to cure both. The treatment comes to the attention of a young Austrian neurologist. His name is Sigmund Freud.
Freud drew a great deal of attention to this magical substance, as he himself called it. He believed it simply made you more normal. It was a wonderful substance that gave you energy, that improved your nerves, that gave you good tone overall. Freud saw it as a real wonder drug.
Eager to study the effects of the drug, Freud, becoming a kind of cocaine guinea pig, experiments with the drug by using it on himself. After one of his first experiments, Freud notes how the drug makes him sexually charged around his fiancée and records his feelings in a love letter to her.
Woe to you, my princess. When I arrive, I will kiss you quite red and feed you till you are plump. And if you are forward, you shall see who is the stronger, a gentle little girl who doesn't eat enough, or a big wild man who has cocaine in his body.
Freud is addicted to cocaine before he knows it. He uses it morning, noon, and night. As a man of science, he records his emotional feelings, body temperature, and muscle strength. After months of taking cocaine, Freud releases a landmark paper that details what he calls the wonderful stimulating effects of the steel drug.
He thought it was an answer to many psychological problems. If somebody would come into his office depressed, he'd give them a little cocaine, they'd feel better, and he thought it was a miracle drug. If they came in depressed the next day, he'd just give them a little more.
Cocaine's addiction takes a toll on Freud, but it will be the truth about the drug that practically devastates him. After other prominent scientists study the cocaine phenomena, the proof is overwhelming. Freud's wonder drug is a fraud.
A doctor named Erlenmeyer did a double-blind study about taking people who are morphine addicts and giving them cocaine, and concluded it didn't do any good at all. And in fact, he predicted that it would be a third great scourge of the human race after alcohol and opium.
Challenged by Erlenmeyer and others, Freud's reputation is in question. He leaves Vienna for Paris to put his affair with cocaine behind him and never uses it again. In Paris, Freud rebuilds his career as the founder of modern psychoanalysis and the interpretations of dreams. Ironically, it was cocaine that inspired such vivid dreams in Freud to begin with. Years later, he returns to Vienna, but the use of cocaine for depression is over. Cocaine does find a legitimate medical application, one still used to this day. A contemporary of Freud named Karl Kohler uses it as a topical anesthesia in eye surgery.
Up till that time, to do a cataract operation meant either you had to use a general anesthetic, ether, people would retch or vomit, and to move that might destroy vision in that situation.
In spite of its dubious medical value, cocaine is widely used in America at the turn of the 20th century. In perfectly legal, self-administered patent medicines, cocaine will harm the lives of those who use it in excess. But still, there are no laws to ban it. That is, until a panic arises out of a popular misconception that cocaine is the cause of African-American violence toward whites. In an atmosphere charged with outright racial hatred, the fear of cocaine-induced violence adds a white backlash and ultimately changes the drug's legal status forever.
The History Channel now returns to Hooked, illegal drugs and how they got that way.
100 years ago, cocaine is an inexpensive legal import, widely used in America to add pep and vigor. Dr. Hamilton Wright, an anti-opium crusader, even suggests cocaine be supplied to African-American dock workers and laborers to increase their productivity. And it is. From an on-the-job pep pill, it became a recreational intoxicant, not out of choice, but rather out of a lack of choice. After the Civil War, alcohol consumption among minorities was banned. It was a post-Civil War, racially motivated policy maintained in southern states that asserted an intoxicated African American was dangerous. That reasoning, in time, spread to cocaine.
All of our drug laws have originally been based on racism, on prejudice against ethnic minorities and their particular customs or their perceived customs. In other words, all of these laws are based on the belief that there is a class in society which can control themselves and there is a class in society which cannot.
The attitude that some classes of people should not be allowed to be intoxicated was a widely held belief in American politics. In 1901, the U.S. Senate passes a resolution introduced by Henry Cabot Lodge to ban the sale of liquor and opiates to all, quote, uncivilized races. Among them are Aboriginal peoples, Eskimos, Hawaiians, railroad workers, and immigrants in port cities. Cocaine escapes the resolution simply because it is relatively unknown beyond the South. But a decade later, it comes to the attention of the nation when headlines report that cocaine is a new Southern menace. The drug is embroiled in the racial tensions of the times.
Around the turn of the century was the peak of lynching of blacks, and also was the peak of taking voting rights away from blacks. So there was a lot of tension between blacks and whites, and much of the violence of blacks against whites was explained by saying they took cocaine.
In attempting to arrest a hitherto peaceful Negro who had become crazed by cocaine, a police officer in self-defense drew his revolver, placed the muzzle over the Negro's heart, and fired. And yet this bullet did not even stagger the crazed Negro, and neither did a second bullet.
That's part of the drug mythology. That in the latter part of the 19th century, there were stories circulating. The phrase was cocaine-crazed Negro in the South, and coming from newspapers that local law enforcement officials claimed that they need a higher caliber bullet to use on a black person under the influence of cocaine, because anything less would not bring him down.
In the eyes of Southern white society, the outrageous conduct of African Americans goes from bad to worse when scandalous sex is added to the trouble that cocaine causes.
There was concern that if an African American man took cocaine, he would be in such a sexually charged state, he would just rape every white woman he saw. Again, it has less to do with the drugs, and I think more to do with racial fears and tensions at the time.
As with opium smoking in San Francisco 50 years earlier, the idea that a drug is used to seduce white women is the final straw. Southern states finally banned cocaine, but the ban only makes the drug illegal, not unavailable. Local bootblacks and newsboys become pushers. For 10 cents, a customer gets a sniff. For a quarter, a day's supply in a pillbox. But this law is only a local law. There are still no federal laws against the use of any drug in the United States. While some states make it a crime for African Americans to use cocaine in the South, there are no restrictions for using medicines that contain it. The reasoning, as embodied in the laws of the day, is that it's perfectly legitimate to use a drug to make you feel better when you are sick. But it's not legitimate to use a drug to change your mood if you are already feeling good. Ironically, it is the medicinal use of cocaine that leads to addiction. After 4 decades of uncontrolled use, cocaine-laced medicines ultimately turns into an epidemic.
The peak in our addiction, in the addiction of the United States, is probably about 1900, when, by some estimates, about 5% of the American public was addicted to one or more of these drugs. There was a great addiction problem among middle-class white women living in a rural area.
At the heart of the cocaine epidemic are fraud and deception. Patent medicine manufacturers refuse to label the ingredients in cure-alls that make preposterous advertising claims. So without even knowing it, men, women, and children dose themselves with cocaine. What finally brings the problem to the attention of Congress is an article in Collier's magazine written by a journalist named Samuel Hopkins Adams.
Gullible America will swallow huge quantities of alcohol, an appalling amount of opiates and narcotics, a wide assortment of varied drugs ranging from powerful and dangerous heart depressants to insidious liver stimulants, and in excess of all ingredients, undiluted fraud.
Adams uncovers abuses that include false advertising claims, illness, addiction, and death caused by patent medicines. It spurs Congress to pass the 1906 Food and Drug Act. It is not a law banning drugs. There are still no national laws that do that. Cocaine, morphine, heroin, opium, and marijuana are widely used and readily available. But the Food and Drug Act helps reduce drug addiction.
It required that habit-forming medications have a label which announces that they are habit-forming. And it also required that the contents of medications be printed on the label. Well, as a result of these regulations, most of the patent medicines went out of business immediately.
Makers of Coca-Cola drop the once alluring ingredient, but keep the name. anti-drug activists fear cocaine will never be banned outright at the national level because such a prohibition requires a radical shift in the law, a constitutional amendment. But there is another option, one as of yet unimagined. It will emerge not from America's drug problem, but the centuries-old epidemic in China. Opium in the Far East will change the use of cocaine in America.
The History Channel now returns to Hook, illegal drugs and how they got that way.
The first federal ban to stem the cocaine epidemic in the United States traces its origins to another drug epidemic in another country. The country is China, and the drug, opium. China retches in the throes of hopeless opium addiction. Britain has forced the drug on China by war. For 100 years, China must endure opium's grip, a horrid condition chronicled time after time. Opium smoking throws whole families into ruin, dissipates every kind of property, and ruins man himself. It wastes the flesh and blood until the skin hangs down in bags and their bones are as naked as billets of wood. When the smoker has pawned everything in his possession, he will pawn his wife and sell his daughters. The United States, spurred by American missionaries, inspires an international treaty to ban the opium trade worldwide. The treaty requires U.S. compliance with the passage of domestic legislation to support it. It is compliance with the treaty that becomes the opportunity anti-drug opponents needed to institute a national drug law without having to enact a constitutional amendment. The law, Congress decides, is to be based on the powers of Congress to tax and regulate interstate commerce, controlling how doctors dispense drugs. At last, anti-drug activists have a way to create the first national drug law, embodied in the Harrison Tax Act of 1914.
The Harrison Act was not the beginning of something. The Harrison Act was the culmination of, say, 15 years of effort to get some sort of control over drugs in America, which had been hampered by the fact that there was a sense of a division between the federal policies and state policies because of the strict construction of the Constitution. Now, the Harrison Act really stretched the Constitution because it said, in effect, that they could control the prescribing practices of physicians, which you think would be a state responsibility.
At first, Congress cannot agree on which drugs to regulate. Heroin is excluded, then added. Even caffeine is a candidate. At the last minute, Southern legislators, seizing the opportunity to list a drug of their choice, insist on cocaine.
They played the race card very well, and that overcame resistance. They made preposterous claims that black men were raping and murdering white families, and that this was a major problem in the South.
Racism adds cocaine to opium, morphine, and heroin to the Harrison Tax Act, the first federal drug law.
What this law did was to basically put a tax on anyone who handled the drug. And it required pharmacists, druggists, doctors, importers, distributors to keep careful records. And obviously, if a doctor was prescribing it very, very liberally, it was sort of a way of keeping a check on that.
The new federal law makes possession of cocaine illegal unless the user is a licensed handler like a doctor or a druggist. The few remaining cocaine-laced products that survived the Food and Drug Act are legislated out of existence. The Harrison Act doesn't only change the law about cocaine, it changes the perception, born in the South, that cocaine is unfit for human consumption.
There was only one drug in the Harrison Act that could not be in any over-the-counter remedy, and that was cocaine. So it shows you how much cocaine had shifted in its image from the 1880s, when it was seen as something good for baseball players, to 1914, when you couldn't have a speck of it in any over-the-counter medicine.
Doctors are permitted to dispense cocaine as long as they abide by the requirements of the Harrison Act, to pay an annual tax, keep records, and only prescribe it, quote, in the due course of medical treatment, unquote. But what is meant by medical treatment? Is giving cocaine to an addict medical treatment?
Up until 1914, it was perfectly lawful for a physician to prescribe these drugs when treating an illness. However, maintaining an addict was something else entirely, and the Supreme Court in a 1919 decision ruled that addiction was not a disease. So if it isn't a disease, a physician can't lawfully prescribe drugs. And what this did was, unintentionally, it created a black market.
By the early 20s, cocaine vanishes as a prescription drug. Doctors stop dispensing it as other medicines, unfettered by the Harrison Act restrictions, replace its use. In the meantime, cocaine's illegal episode begins. Agents of the newly created Federal Narcotics Bureau, a division of the Treasury Department and Customs, try to police the drug out of existence. Still, cocaine never really goes away completely. In the Hollywood of the 1920s, illicit cocaine parties, or snowballs, are in fashion.
There were some notable Hollywood stars who overdosed or who had problems based on their drug use. Then Hollywood began censoring them and blackballing known addicts. So again, use started to decline.
The idea of a drug being illegal on a national level in the United States is an entirely modern concept. Prior to the 20th century, only a handful of states banned the use of cocaine or other drugs. But the democratic process turns cocaine into a controlled substance. But in the process, the government inadvertently created new social problems. It turned users and addicts into criminals, closed drug maintenance clinics, jailed doctors, and put addicts and users in prison. Pressed for a method of coping with the newly created illegal drugs, the government initiates a triple strategy.
One was increasing punishments for anybody who did use any of these things. The second one was exaggeration. That is, to make it, and put these sound so awful that if you tried it, it would be an absolute disaster, so to keep people from even trying it once. And the third prong of this strategy was silence, which basically was the one that was preferred, to stop talking about drugs in school, to really just not have it on the horizon.
The new drug law, like Albert Niemann, who let a deadly genie loose with his synthesis of cocaine, initiates an unforeseen chain of events that changes the world.
I'm totally convinced the Congress of 1914 would never have passed the Harrison Act if they could see the nightmare that it has created today with a $400 billion black market, prisons overflowing, the violence and the corruption, that this little act, this created a sea change in the whole way in which drug users were looked at.
Illegal cocaine use vanishes during the Great Depression. But by the rebellious 60s, cocaine use returns.
Wow, what a trip.
A decade later, cocaine is entrenched as the new in-drug and attitude of the disco era, and a culture of denial fuels it. By the 80s, cocaine use is a full-fledged epidemic. To meet the demand, South American producers will become very sophisticated and ruthless in getting cocaine into American hands, where it is the drug of power, sex, and glamour, the embodiment of the United States in the 1980s. Only the will of the government and the resolve of Americans will stop it.
Sunday on the History Channel. Buckle your seatbelts for a 4-cylinder frenzy. Dragster versus Jeep.
Your boy's going down.
R. Lee races for the finish line on Mail Call. Sunday night at 10 on the History Channel.
All right.
The History Channel now returns to Hooked, illegal drugs and how they got that way.
At the dawn of the 20th century, heroin abuse was at an all-time high. As the epidemic began to decline, a surge in cocaine use followed. At the twilight of the century, the same pattern occurred. From 1970 to 1990, heroin and cocaine use were back in tandem. But during the modern epidemic, there is an unprecedented surge in crime. Out of the violence specifically attributed to heroin emerges an entirely new national code. It brings all drugs, illegal and otherwise, under federal regulation. But it's not just the use of heroin that inspires American lawmakers to action. It's who's using it that gets the attention of the President of the United States.
Most people don't realize that the original war on drugs, which was declared officially by President Nixon, grew out of concern about American soldiers in Vietnam who had suddenly begun using heroin in very large numbers about a year prior to that. And this had become a very big issue, and the President and the administration were deeply concerned that heroin was going to take out the American troops from Vietnam.
Under Nixon, old federal drug laws are wiped off the books. A modern regimen brings illegal drugs under the Justice Department and the newly created Drug Enforcement Administration. Possession of cocaine, illegal in 1914, without a license, is still illegal, but the penalties and policing are tougher. Yet cocaine use soars. What fuels its epidemic use is the perception that cocaine is cool. Rolling Stone calls it America's star-spangled powder, and the New York Times writes it is the champagne of drugs. By the mid-1980s, cocaine is king. The drug of the elite is now the drug of the people. To feed that need, an average of 150 tons of cocaine enters the country each year.
Despite our best efforts, illegal cocaine is coming into our country at alarming levels, and 4 to 5 million people regularly use it.
What creates the supply is the fortune derived from a drug that costs pennies to produce. In the 1980s, cocaine becomes a billion-dollar business.
And all the cops and armies in the world can't stop something with a 17,000% profit markup. For example, if I could manufacture this pen for $1 and I could sell it for $17,000, the government could never stop this.
There is enough cold, hard cash from cocaine that drug cartels have enough power to rival legitimate governments. There is so much money that laundering it has become a spin-off business of its own. Money that is more difficult to conceal than the drug itself. The flood of money has made street dealers into millionaires.
I can't even fathom having as much money as I had. And I was giving this guy $3,000 a day to follow me around, just protect me. Because I didn't want to get hurt. I didn't want my drugs to get taken.
There is money in smuggling it and money in stopping it. Billions are spent on the hardware and manpower to keep cocaine out of the United States. The war on drugs has turned into a high-tech game of cat and mouse. While no one can estimate the money paid for illegal cocaine, the money spent to stop it under President Reagan's war on drugs is over 5 times the amount when President Nixon declared war 15 years earlier.
Winning the crusade against drugs will not be achieved by just throwing money at the problem. Your government will continue to act aggressively, but nothing would be more effective than for Americans simply to quit using illegal drugs.
The Reagans, with Nancy at the lead, begin a serious service campaign to amplify already established parent movements.
We want you to help us create an outspoken intolerance for drug use. For the sake of our children, I implore each of you to be unyielding and inflexible in your opposition to drugs.
You say when somebody offers you drugs, what do you say?
What happened in the early 80s was the emergence of a different kind of anti-drug movement that was particularly focused on what was called the parents' movement. And Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign captured that spirit. And there was a downturn, a very dramatic downturn in the use of illegal drugs, particularly among young people.
Casual drug use does begin to decline. But for the Reagan administration, the battle isn't over.
There's a new epidemic, smokable cocaine, otherwise known as crack. It is an explosively destructive and often lethal substance which is crushing its users. It is an uncontrolled fire.
Crack takes the nation by storm. It is cocaine cooked down to its base and smoked rather than snorted. The process delivers a highly concentrated dose to the brain faster than before. For the user, crack is both cheaper and more addictive. A gram of cocaine costs about $100. Crack is $10 or $20 a rock, but a crack addict often spends $300 to $400 for an all-night binge, for a high users describe as a body orgasm. In the war on drugs, crack is an all-out assault on urban America by the increasingly powerful Colombian drug cartels.
It's fair to say the United States and the world is awash in illegal drug money, illegal drugs, illegal drug corruption, illegal drug violence. I don't mean violence caused by the drugs, I mean violence caused by the commerce in illegal drugs.
While the drug cartels reap an estimated $80 billion a year, for Americans, the budget for the high-tech war on drugs increases in every fiscal season.
It's a constant battle. It's never over. You know, it was heroin early on, then we went to cocaine, then we went to crack cocaine. We on the inside and responsible people know it's a constant battle. There'll always be a challenge that a generation will have to face in terms of should I use this substance or should I not use the substance.
I have concluded after 35 years that although you can help people with treatment, and education does help, that at the bottom, when you get to all things done, the problem is that the drugs really do work, and large numbers of people want those drugs.
Since it was first synthesized in 1860, cocaine has been one of the most addictive substances in the world. It has alternately been praised and scorned, exalted as a wonder drug, and condemned as the third scourge. Behind the evil shadow of the drug is a chemical that makes life, for a short time, feel better. And that's what has America hooked.